Yes. Hello. Can writers and performers learn from meditation facilitators and vice versa? Uh, what has the art of leading guided meditations got to do with other forms of verbal artistry? And why do Eastern practices of leading meditations invite us to reconsider the very nature of poetry as we understand it? In this video, I'm going to share some of my research as an author and some professional reflections on being a poet and a performer, and more recently, a mental resilience coach who leads guided meditations and has been chewing this subject over quite significantly. As with all my vlogs, this is for anyone interested in language, performance, or the human psyche more generally. I talk a lot about poetry, but what I'm saying really applies to verbal artistry in all of its forms. So if you have a voice, this one's for you. So both poetry and meditation are forms of controlled dreaming. They use words, they use imagery, they use the spoken voice to really to orchestrate the nervous system of other people, I would say, allowing the listener to sink into a moment, to quote Mikey Matania, like sinking into a warm bath, right? And in order to do this, it's really important that both of them get rid of all abstract concepts, right? Grounding the listener in a tangible sensory experience with words. The wind is caressing your face, right? Whatever it might be. And the person who's guiding this experience is really creating an almost cinematic environment with their words. And to help them do this, they're deploying metaphors, they're deploying similes. But the key things about these figures of speech is that they're done sparingly and they're done skillfully, right? Because if they're not, what can happen is that we get that classic taboo of creative writing, which is mixed metaphors, where we crowd out the mind of the listener and it gets them confused. And this is also true of meditation. For example, if I was inviting you to imagine that you're floating in a warm blue sky, and then moments later that you were submerging yourself in a sea, you might get confused on how to navigate that environment, and that might distract you and throw you a bit, right? So those are some of the similarities. What meditation is not is the poetry of story, the poetry of anecdotes, the poetry of characters. You might find more of that in other forms of meditation, such as hypnotism. But in most cases, stories and details can take the listener away from their own body. So the meditative poetic is grounded in a spaciousness that allows for the imaginative involvement, or perhaps the imaginative non-involvement of the listener. As the old Chinese sage Lao Tzu might have said, the poem does by not doing. And silences are really, really important, I think, in that regard. And indeed, ancient wisdom traditions in the East have a very almost kind of germinal connection to poetry. Haikus are a form of Zen Buddhist meditation. Originally, they were a meditative practice, a spoken meditative practice, right? They don't have fancy language. They don't have complex symbolism. They're really just short, sharp, kind of camera shot, pure observations to paint a scene or an image that lands the listener in a particular moment. This is a beautiful translation of a famous Basho haiku by Alan Watts. The old pond, a frog jumps in, plop. And if anybody's interested in this subject, actually check out Alan Watts's online lecture about Zen poetry, which you can find on YouTube. I recommend that if you want to learn more about that. So this connection between poetry and verbal healing also has a history in the West. And really, right up until the last few centuries, you'd have European folk healers in the British Isles, that was called often called cunning men and women, would conjure altered states of consciousness by charming people with spells, charms, incantations, medicine poems, all of these things to promote healing and to transport people with the human voice. Sadly, much of this oral law was lost to us because of the witch hunts. This is a very feminine form of knowledge, and it was also an oral form of knowledge. So not only was it repressed by the patriarchy, but it was also repressed by a growing intellectual establishment, educational establishment, which considered it to be superstitious. And the church also considered it to be heathen, a pagan, dangerous knowledge. So much of that incredible wisdom is lost to us, and kind of fragments of it still remain in, idiomatically in our language. An apple a day keeps the doctor away. Small things like that, and maybe kind of like genealogical traces of a poetic culture of healing people with words that has really been lost, I think, to Western culture. Now, all of these practices that I'm speaking of belong to a rich oral tradition. They're dialogical, they're invitational, they recognise the presence of other people in the room. And this is true also of meditation, right? I invite you to imagine a feeling of expansiveness emanating from your chest. But we don't often associate poetry as being a conversation, right? And this, I think, because of the textual nature of what we conceive poetry to be here in the West, right? Underline the poetic devices used. Silence for the next 10 minutes. But as with meditation, live literature, when done skillfully, is really an act of interaction, right? And is an act of regulating the experience of the listeners in the room. If anybody's interested in this, there's a really, really cool book by Julia Novak called Live Poetry, which goes into a lot of detail about the mechanics of how we can unpack this, of poetry when it's performed. So check that out if you're interested. So let's go a little bit further into the act of performance, which I think is really central, both to poetry and to meditation. In meditation, as in performed verse, experience is evoked as much through the delivery of what you're saying as what you're saying. The meditation facilitator, as the poet, is as much a musician as they are a composer of words. So cadence, texture, tone of voice, if we're publishing our words with our voice, all of these things should, I believe, be considered, and they should be rehearsed with hypnotist's precision. Both meditation and poetry are interpersonal, right? They're intersubjective. Context is everything. And by context, I literally mean context with the text. How can we use the words before, during, and after the meditation or the poem to work the vibe in the room? Yeah. If a glass breaks at the back of the room, do we ignore the glass, or do we integrate that into what's happening? So what is the experience of the listener? Are they comfortable? How quickly are they breathing? Can their breathing be slowed down? Can we excite the listener? What can the performer do to the body of other people in the room? I think is a key question here, right? So to conclude, if you're a poet, this, I hope, is a provocation to expand the repertoire of what you are offering to your community. The poet, I believe, is not just a writer or even a performer. They're also a facilitator, a master of ceremony, a space holder, to use a really annoying hippie term, a meditation leader, yeah, in one form or another, a healer, and a gobshite. And the greatest of all those is gobshitery. Now, if you are a meditation leader, conversely, I invite you to think very carefully and poetically about the words that you're dropping when you're dropping them, especially when you're dealing with groups of people who are in a very open, contemplative state. Maybe it's really, really worth diving in to the choices of words that you're using and learning from the millennia of oral and literary inheritance that we have in the form of Zen poetry, haikus, all the poetry that is on offer that we can use to artfully assemble words and to orchestrate the nervous systems of people. So this is a fascinating confluence of disciplines, I think, and it's something that deserves a lot more conversation. If anybody's interested in learning more, I have a book. I'm not going to go into that because I'm often kind of plugging my book on these sessions, but Stage Invasion is available to buy, and depending when you're listening to this, it's currently half price for Christmas, so get yourself a copy of that. I'd also like to thank some patrons, Sarah, Zander, Sarah Knott, Jen, Tom, Andrea, James, and Catherine. Thank you for your support. If you are enjoying these videos, please subscribe to wherever you're listening to. And also, if you're on YouTube, press that little bell button and then you will actually hear from me when we do this again. Nice one.